Well, here we go. Welcome to session 9 of the One Spirit of Original Christianity. Many of us are familiar with the concept of word studies because they are one of the most basic forms of Bible study. And I recommend that every student of the Bible get a Young's Concordance and learn how to do word studies. Now, I know that Young's Concordance is based on King James and it's quote-unquote old-fashioned and it has some deficiencies, but because of the plethora of reference books that are based on King James, it's still king, all right? Word studies work best with literal translations like King James. And if you can get over the these and thous, you can learn a whole lot. So I have more information on how to do word studies in my Work in the Word class, and also about how signpost words work, because I'm fascinated by words. The subject of word studies gives me the opportunity to explain a few things. This love for words comes from my background, because my father was self-taught in zoology and botany, and he specialized in Midwest American species. He learned so much by observation and reading that he can converse on the same level with my brother-in-law, who was a PhD in botany. The only thing my dad didn't know was the Latin names. And growing up like with him had a great effect on us kids, because we were all independent thinkers, teachers, and entrepreneurs. Another effect of my childhood was, unfortunately, I was severely bullied, and that drove me inward to be a thinker. Plus, then the only friends I had were math, science, and the biographies in my elementary school library. So I would take home 2 or 3 books, the thick ones, every weekend and read them. So the side effect in me was I realized I didn't need to spend hours in a classroom. I could learn the same stuff by reading and from practical application. So that resulted in me pursuing higher education the way that I wanted. So I'm self-taught in a lot of things. Plus, my interest then radically changed in my college years because I got involved in the Bible fellowships. Before that time, I was an organic chemistry nerd. And I took all the science courses I could, and they had to force me to take humanities. But after that change, I was still a geek. But I took Greek and theology classes, and I applied the scientific method to them. But because of that shift in interests halfway through college, I've had 8 years of college, but I only have an associate's degree in theology. But I've written the equivalent of many theses that probably could pass for doctor's degree dissertations. Now, every one of us has innate talents that we can build on. I build on mine, and you have yours, and they're just as important. We're all part of a body, and each of us has valuable stuff to contribute. So I encourage you to find whatever your passion is and pursue it. Mine includes words. And these online classes of the ones of Original Christianity have been the equivalent of researching and writing maybe a 20 to 40 page college level paper every week. And the transcriptions of all these 2 years so far could probably work out to 5,000 or 6,000 pages in book form. So help, I need an editor. Had I pursued my education and loaded up on school loan debt, I probably would have gone into linguistics, but that also probably would have fossilized me and discouraged me from thinking outside the box. I probably wouldn't have discovered things like signpost words and repetitions. So I'm going to pass on to you some gems that I've learned about doing word studies. E.W. Bullinger, in How to Study the Bible, pointed out the usefulness of looking at the first use of words. Often, the basics for a word or phrase are given in the context of their first use, and it is uncannily accurate. And that helps prove the divine origin of the Bible. Also, with word studies, concurrence is king. The Bible fits because God is the author. It does not contradict itself. So no matter how intelligent you may be, even if you cannot put things into succinct definitions, we can know the truth because we've looked at it in multiple verses. And that's why word studies are so basic to Bible study for anyone. Because if we hang around long enough with any person, we'll get to know them. Well, the same's true for Bible study. If you hang around any concept long enough by looking at all the verses and thinking about them, you'll get to know them. And God will make sure of that too. He'll send people to you or other ways of making sure you understand. He'll satisfy your hunger. And all of this is Semitic learning based, because wisdom is the goal. See, that is pursuing truths rather than just being satisfied with somebody giving you knowledge. Now, when you do word studies, you have to consider all the words in the family of words, including root words and derivations, in order to understand the concept. Nouns and verbs, adjectives and adverbs, prefixed words. If you really want to do a thorough study, you need to look at all of them instead of just one. All right? Because many times those other words, the noun or the verb form, will have the same set of signpost words. Now, what I mean by signpost words, I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but they're the associated words that show up in the context when you do a word study. And when you do that, like Wayne showed us, you have to be inductive and not deductive. You have to look for traits. You have to think out loud. See? And you don't want to bring any preconceived ideas to the table because you want to let the evidence speak for itself. Now, I talked about signpost words a little bit. These are other terms that frequently show up in the context. And they show up in the same context with statistical significance. In the work and word class, I show how to set up a grid, like in a spreadsheet, and then you note the occurrence of the other associated terms. And when you're done, you'll see they show up with statistical significance in almost every context. So when I do a word study, I just don't look at the verse where the word I am tracking occurs. I look at the whole paragraph. And the paragraph marks in King James will help, but they're not always correct. Also, sometimes the chapter divisions are in the wrong place. So to double check, just look at the connective words like and or but or for or when, and that will indicate the thought flow, so you should be able to discern when a new subject begins and then when it changes to another subject. That's a paragraph. And a wherefore or a therefore often concludes a paragraph with practical application. Now, there's a few mistakes I've observed with people doing word studies, and one of them is when they try to determine what the root words are. Now, just because one word looks similar to another does not necessarily mean they are related. I would leave that up to the lexicons. But there is a word family index in the front of the Tyndale Word Study Concordance. That'll show root words. Also, Brown Driver Briggs, which is the Hebrew lexicon, frequently lists the Semitic roots for Hebrew words. Now, one pet peeve I have with word studies is with the Septuagint. Often, people try to find the Hebrew equivalent of a Greek word or vice versa. Now, I think it's pretty clear, though, that pneuma is the Greek equivalent of rauch. It shows up often. But sometimes with lesser frequencies, you get a word that might not actually be the equivalent. Because you see, the Septuagint was not translated by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. The Pentateuch part was pretty accurate because of how important the Pentateuch was. But later on in some of the other books, they got to be rather free, almost a paraphrase in some places. So if you want to do a word study and try to figure out what the equivalent is, I recommend doing 2 word studies, one in the Old Testament and one in the New, because there rarely is an exact one-to-one correspondence between words that are in different languages. And in this case especially because Greek and Hebrew are from different language families. One's Semitic and the other's Indo-European. So most of us are familiar with Bullinger's Critical Greek Lexicon and Concordance. That gives longer word definitions than you find in Young's Concordance. I know there are some people who use Strong's Concordance instead of Young's. That also has longer definitions. Also, Strong's Concordance assigns a number to Hebrew words and Greek words. That makes it easier to use for folks who don't know the Hebrew or Greek alphabet. And nowadays, those numbers have spread into use in interlinears and other reference books that really make it easier to study than looking at the Greek or Hebrew words. Now, if you want an equivalent in Hebrew for Bullinger's Critical Greek Lexicon and Concordance, there is Wilson's Old Testament Word Studies. That's set up like Bullinger is. Then the top reference book for biblical Hebrew is Brown, Driver, and Briggs. That has a lot of info. The newer editions of Brown, Driver, Briggs have Strong's numbers. That makes it easier to use. But the free old version of Brown, Driver, Briggs is on archive.org that you can download in PDF form for free. In Greek, the next step up from Young's and Bullinger is Thayer's lexicon. Thayer gives really lengthy definitions, and he's very valuable because he breaks up the meanings into parts. He often will cite all of the occurrences of a Greek word in the New Testament, separated out into its several meanings. When he does that, at the end of the handling of that word, he puts an asterisk. So that means you got all the occurrences there. The newer editions of Thayer are also coded with Strong's numbers, but the old free version on archive.org does not have it. Now, there are more advanced Greek resources beyond these, and I covered them in my Work in the Word class. I have a whole session where I go through all the different reference books, show which ones are beginners, which ones are intermediate, which ones are advanced, and what they're for. But there's one more reference book that I did not cover in the Work in the Word class, and that was something that Wayne introduced to me a decade ago, and it's called the L-O-U-W, NIDA, N-I-D-A, Greek English Lexicon of the New Testament based on semantic domains. It's a long title, but a semantic domain is all of the words on a subject that span the full range of a meaning. For example, the concept of hitting. The semantic range covers all the words that involve hitting, varied by the amount of force. So touch, tap, slap, the connotation there is an open hand, punch, that's harder, but the connotation is a fist, and it's also horizontal in direction. Pound, that's vertical usually. Bash, beat, and that uses an instrument instead of your hand. So you see the range there. Also, of the frequency, like pummel, that's all part of that domain. So you see what a semantic domain is? It's all the general words of a concept, but they range in connotation in various ways. So that's a semantic domain. And Lonita, in his preface, says some of the factors in analyzing word meanings in each domain are: first, there are no exact synonyms, and this is true in the word. God has a meaning or reason for everything he says, where he says it, how he says it, to whom he says it, when he says it. So synonyms differ for a reason, all right? And then meanings are determined by signals in the context. You saw that with how Wayne handled the occurrences of ruach. Then there's figurative meanings possible. You saw that too. Metaphorical or comparative meanings, apart from the whole, would be a synecdoche, etc. Now, another idea that the Lunita preface mentions is that these groupings of meanings are, quote-unquote, irregular constellations instead of being logically arranged. And one of the things that I see people do sometimes is they try to logic their way through meanings. Well, the meanings are established by the vagaries of human use. And so you can't, they're illogical many times, how it came to mean what it does. And so the only way to really see what it means is to do a word study, and then you see what the use was. All right? Now, this especially is the case with the New Testament, because the New Testament was written in Koine, or Common Greek, the vernacular of that time. However, in the Bible, that involves a specific subset of Koine Greek, because the Bible is full of ecclesiastical terminology that was established and maintained by the apostles. So they had special meanings for words that they used. And also, the biblical language was influenced by its Hebrew counterparts. So when it comes to the Hebrew and Greek equivalents, a Hebrew word may be at a different part of the semantic domain than the nearest Greek word. So they're not equal. In other words, the Hebrew word, the connotation might be like tap, while the nearest Greek word, the connotation might be like punch. So they're hitting in general, but the connotations are at different parts in the semantic domain. So they may generally fit, but their connotations rarely match. So the best way to avoid discrepancies is to do 2 word studies, one in Hebrew and one in Greek. I know it's extra work, but you will be rewarded because you will come to know it and you'll be able to explain it. See, we're not just memorizing definitions. We're going in there and thinking, doing inductive thought, looking at all the context around, and you will come to know it more deeply than just reading it in a lexicon. Now, another thing people try to do often is they try to figure out numeric significance, first use, second use, having significance, etc. Now, if that stuff is intended, it'll be apparent. If the writer intended for there to be numeric significance, especially in lists and stuff, it'll be apparent. You don't have to squeeze it. All right? So I always do a sniff test with number 5 and number 7. If they fit, then I pursue it. But another thing, though, numerics, since they're symbolic and sometimes they're kind of iffy, I do not base things primarily on numerics. They're supportive in nature, but not determinative. All right. Also, when people build words from roots, like especially in Greek, where you have a word and then you have a prefix that's a preposition, and then you put that word together. Well, it's not always logical like we think. Um, see, you can get a general idea of what the word means from the root word and then the effect that's added by the prepositional prefix. But the specific meaning is always determined by usage, not theory. So you have to do a word study. That's what'll figure it out. That's why they're so valuable. So, for example, with proskuneo, that's to worship that Wayne taught us about. Its component parts are pros, toward, and kuneo, to kiss toward. All right? But that meaning is not literally found anywhere. In other words, they did not literally worship by blowing kisses at the sky. All right? Excuse me while I kiss the sky. All right? No, that's not how they worshiped. Another pet peeve I have is when people go down through the possible meanings of a word in a lexicon and they just pick out the one they like, the one that fits their theology, and then they impose it on a scripture. Now, I know that when we're pressed for time, we all do that, okay? And I dislike that when I have to do it, all right? But sometimes I'm pressed for time. But I hate it when I have to do that. But the best way is to see what the signals are in the context. Now, Thayer is very good for that because he will give all kinds of grammatical information or other things that affect the meaning. And so you go down through Bullinger, you look at all the different traits that he talks about, and you see what fits. For example, our Trinitarian friends don't like our use of pros in John 1:1 from Bullinger as together with yet distinctly independent of. I mean, they'd rather go down through the lexicon and pick another meaning that fits their theology. But on page 542 of Thayer's lexicon, he points out the contextual features with pros that'll tell us what that meaning exactly is, where he shows pros plus the accusative case, that means with, and then he says the following, quote, this is meaning number 2. He says, it is used of close proximity, the idea of direction, though not entirely lost, being more or less weakened, that toward direction. So then he says that with the accusative of a person, after verbs of remaining, dwelling, or tarrying, and then he says after verbs to be, all right? And then he lists a whole bunch of places where pros with the accusative is used with a verb to be, just like in John 1:1. For example, one of them is Mark 9:19. There, pros is used with the accusative with the form of the verb to be. Jesus said, he answered him and said, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? So be is the verb to be, with is pros with the accusative, you is accusative. How long shall I be with you? Well, was Jesus part of the faithless generation? Heavens no. He was together with it, yet distinctly independent of it. Wow. Now, that detail was buried in 3 pages of hard-to-read details in Thayer's lexicon that's printed in several different fonts. And I don't know how I found it. I think God helped. But there's many gems like that in Thayer if you take the time to read it. So, in other words, there are signals. There's signals. Because, like I said, the prophet knew what he was talking about when he wrote what he wrote. And many times, there will be signals in there. Now, sure, sometimes the prophet knew who his audience was and would anticipate how they would handle it. And Jesus did this many times, talking to the Pharisees, where he would structure it with A, B structure so that you couldn't take it wrong. Well, of course, nowadays we don't know about that, so we have taken it wrong. But there are signals many times in the context that will tell you which one it is. See, another icon I think that needs to be broken is that words in the Bible only have one meaning. This is very unrealistic. If you look at any dictionary, above an elementary level dictionary, in any language, you'll be hard-pressed to find more than a couple words per page that only have one meaning. So when you do a word study, please don't try to shoehorn all the meanings into one. All right? And many meanings can differ on the basis of many different factors. For example, if something's transitive or intransitive, that means the verb has a direct object or not. All right? Or verb tenses, especially in Hebrew, will affect the meaning of a word. All right? Also in Greek, the different voices of verbs, passive voice, middle voice usually, will affect the meaning of the verb. For example, luo means to loose, but in the middle voice, to loose for oneself, it means to redeem. See? So just because there's, you can't expect a word to mean one thing. There's a lot of different factors that affect it. Also, we showed how proskuneo is affected by the case of the object. Wayne also mentioned akuo, that is affected by the case of its object. Those kinds of details will be found in lexicons if they've been discovered. The one about proskuneo, no one knew about that. I discovered that in 1978 and shared it with Wayne, and he thought it was so interesting that he did a book on it. So Wayne's the expert on that now. Then singular and plural effects. For example, the word rising, if it is singular, it means the sunrise. If the word rising is plural, it means the direction east. So then there are all kinds of contextual effects. So if something is an athletic context or a mercantile context or a legal context, like hypostasis in a legal context means title deed, while in a philosophical context, like in Hebrews 11:3, it means the main subject for a story or the basis for a premise. There can be military, there can be nautical, like with ships. John Zika, a classic Greek scholar, shared with me a meaning for apostasis in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, where a departure, it was like a ship standing offshore because there's no dock, and the little ships would go out to it. So that was an apostasis, a standing offshore. And that's just like the gathering together. He's going to come, and the little ships, us, are going to go out to him. Really neat. There are agricultural, all kinds of different contextual effects on words. And then also there could be effects that are actual or potential or causal or resultant or instrumental. It could be in the process at beginning or the ending. And then there are cultural influences and finally figurative uses. So there's a whole galaxy of things that can affect words. And to get a flavor for that, you look at Thayer's, and he'll show you how they differ, and then you just look for the signals in the context. And that's basically what this study on Rauch and Pneuma is, where we know there's not just one meaning. We look for the signals, and they separate out in the context. So that was a short introduction to the uses of pneuma in the New Testament.